Elizabeth stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting her pearl necklace, a gift from Henry on their 30th anniversary. Today, they were celebrating 40 years together, 4 decades of life together, of joys and hardships. Her gaze slid over the wrinkles around her eyes, witnesses to the years she had lived. At 62, she still retained the elegance and posture for which the Davidson family was known. "Mrs. Montgomery, the flowers for the table have already been delivered." Margaret looked into the room. "Do you want me to arrange them now?" Elizabeth turned to the housekeeper. "Yes, please. And check if the wine needs to be added to the fridge. Henry likes his Chardonnay at the right temperature." Margaret nodded and disappeared behind the door. Something in her eyes seemed strange to Elizabeth, but she dismissed it. Many things seemed strange to her lately. "Don't forget to check on the fish," Elizabeth called after her. "Henry hates overcooked salmon." "Don't worry, Mrs. Montgomery. I know Mr. Henry's tastes very well," Margaret replied with a subtle smile. Elizabeth froze. Something in Margaret's tone made her heart sink. "I know Mr. Henry's tastes very well," echoed in her head. As she walked down the stairs, she recalled how Henry's behavior had changed in recent months. Late returns from work, mysterious phone calls that he avoided in front of her, new ties she hadn't bought, the smell of unfamiliar perfume that sometimes wafted from his shirts. "Honey, you look amazing." Henry appeared in the living room holding a glass of whiskey. He was wearing a new suit that she'd never seen before. "Thank you, dear. You look great, too," Elizabeth replied, trying not to notice how he was avoiding her gaze. "A new suit? Oh, yes. I bought it last week. I had an important dinner with investors," he answered quickly, too quickly. Everything was ready for dinner. Margaret was bustling around the table, arranging plates and utensils. She was wearing a new dress, simple but elegant. Too elegant for a housewife, Elizabeth thought. "Everything is just perfect, Margaret," Elizabeth praised. "You have outdone yourself. It's the least I can do for such a special evening," Margaret replied, and again that strange look of guilt mixed with triumph. Henry was unusually silent at dinner. Elizabeth tried to keep the conversation going. "Do you remember our first anniversary? That little restaurant in Provence. You said then that you had never met a woman as special as me." "Of course, darling," he replied absently, tapping his fingers on the table. "Excuse me, I have to take this call. It's an important matter." He left the table, leaving Elizabeth alone with the untouched dish. Margaret came in to clear the empty plates. Her movements were smooth, confident, as if she felt completely at home in this house. "Would you like me to bring dessert?" she asked. "I made Mr. Henry's favorite cheesecake with wild berries." How does she know about his favorite dessert? Elizabeth thought. "Not yet," she replied, standing up. "I want to go upstairs to get a present for Henry. Whatever you say, Mrs. Montgomery." Margaret looked down, but Elizabeth could see something like panic in her eyes. As she walked up the stairs, Elizabeth heard muffled voices coming from her husband's office. The door was ajar, and the words came through clearly. "We can't go on like this." It was Margaret's voice. "Quiet," she might hear. Henry interrupted her. Elizabeth froze, feeling the blood drain from her face. 40 years of marriage flashed before her eyes. 40 years of devotion, love, trust. She took a step toward the office door, but stopped. No, now was not the time to show her cards. She backed away slowly, trying not to give away her presence. A plan was already beginning to form in her mind. They think they know her, the meek, predictable Elizabeth Montgomery. But they have no idea what a woman who has lost everything but her thirst for justice is capable of. The evening dragged on unbearably long. Elizabeth sat at the festive table, mechanically maintaining the conversation, while the words she had heard in the office still echoed in her head. Every look, every gesture now took on a new meaning. "Darling, you've hardly touched your wine." Henry reached for her glass with feigned concern. "I'm saving it for a special moment," Elizabeth replied, forcing a smile. "By the way, I haven't shown you my gift yet." Margaret, who was clearing the dessert plates, flinched slightly. "Oh, you needn't have worried." Henry took a sip of whiskey. "Your presence is the best gift I could have given." "Nonsense." Elizabeth stood up. A 40th anniversary only comes around once in a lifetime. I left the gift in the bedroom. Do you want me to get it? Margaret quickly offered, and Elizabeth noticed her husband tense up. No, thank you, I'll get it, she replied firmly. It's a personal gift. As Elizabeth walked up the stairs, she could hear the conversation downstairs. She deliberately made her steps heavier so that she could hear herself ascending. When she reached the top landing, she took off her shoes and silently returned to the stairs. We can't take any more risks, Margaret whispered. She suspects something. Don't be silly, Henry replied. Elizabeth hasn't noticed anything for 20 years. Why should that change now? 20 years. These words hit her like a hammer. Elizabeth put her hand over her mouth to keep from giving herself away. 20 years of betrayal, lies, humiliation. Mr. Montgomery. Margaret's voice was as sweet as molasses. You promised me that we would be together, that you would leave her after— Hush! Henry interrupted her sharply. Not here and not now. Elizabeth heard them move closer to each other, the sound of a kiss. Nausea rose to her throat. She silently went upstairs and entered the bedroom, closing the door behind her. An elegant woman in an evening gown reflected in the mirror. A woman who had been betrayed and humiliated. But there were no tears in her eyes, only cold determination. Mrs. Montgomery? Margaret knocked on the door. Are you all right? Mr. Henry is worried. Worried, Elizabeth smiled bitterly. 20 years. How many others like Margaret had been there? How many times had he worried while she believed in their happy marriage? Yes, everything is fine, she answered calmly. I'm just looking for a gift. I think I put it in the wrong place. Elizabeth went to her dressing table. There was an envelope in the top drawer, her real gift to Henry. Documents on the purchase of a house on the coast, which she planned to give him for their vacation together. Now these papers seemed like a bitter mockery. Honey, why don't you come downstairs? Henry's voice came from downstairs. Margaret had made a wonderful dessert. Of course, dear, she replied. I'll be right down. Elizabeth took another envelope out of the safe, the one that contained copies of all their family's financial documents. She had always been foresighted. Now that foresight would become her weapon. As she walked down to the living room, she saw Margaret leaning over Henry, serving him dessert. Their fingers met for a moment, and Elizabeth noticed the tenderness in that touch, the same tenderness that had long been absent from her husband's touch. Here you are, my dear. Henry raised his glass. To our 40 years together. Elizabeth raised her glass, looking him straight in the eye. To the truth, dear, whatever it may be. She saw Margaret's hand tremble as she poured the wine. What do you mean? Henry asked tensely. Oh, just a toast. Elizabeth smiled mysteriously. After all, the truth is the most valuable gift in marriage, isn't it? The evening ended earlier than planned. Henry cited a headache, and Margaret quickly cleared the table, avoiding looking Elizabeth in the eye. Lying in bed next to her husband, who was pretending to sleep, Elizabeth planned her next steps. They thought they could destroy her life. But what they didn't know was that her years of silent devotion had made her stronger than anyone could have imagined. And now it was time to show that strength. Elizabeth woke up before dawn. Henry was sleeping next to her, his breathing steady and calm. She quietly got out of bed, put on a robe, and went down to the kitchen. She needed time to think, to plan her next steps. Oh, Mrs. Montgomery! Margaret jumped when she saw her. I didn't expect you so early. I couldn't sleep after last night's celebration, Elizabeth replied, watching the housekeeper nervously shuffle papers on the table. What have you got there? Just bills, for the household. Margaret hastily stuffed the papers into her bag. Let me see, Elizabeth said calmly. Lately, our expenses seem a little unusual. Margaret reluctantly held out the papers. Elizabeth looked through them slowly, keeping her expression steady. Bills for restaurants, hotels, a jewelry store, all paid for with Henry's card. Interesting, Elizabeth said. It seems that our expenses have increased significantly in recent months. Margaret nervously ran her fingers over the edge of her apron. Prices are so high now. Indeed. Elizabeth sipped her coffee thoughtfully. You know, I've decided to take more of an interest in our finances. For so many years I've left it all to Henry. But Mr. Montgomery is doing a wonderful job. Margaret answered quickly. Of course, Elizabeth smiled. But I thought maybe I should take some of the responsibility. I am his wife, after all. Margaret's eyes flashed with concern. You suspect something? Suspect? Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. What would I suspect? I just want to be more aware of the family's affairs. At that moment, footsteps were heard upstairs. Henry woke up. Margaret quickly gathered the bills. Good morning, my darlings. Henry came into the kitchen. How did you sleep after yesterday? Very well, dear, Elizabeth replied. Margaret and I were just discussing household matters. Really? He sounded tense. Yes, I've decided to take more of a hand in our finances, Elizabeth said innocently. You've been doing everything yourself for so many years. It's time for me to get involved. Henry tensed slightly. Why, I'm doing just fine. Of course, dear. Elizabeth smiled gently. But I want to be of service. I'll start by reviewing the accounts for the last few years. Maybe I can find ways to optimize our expenses. Margaret suddenly dropped her cup, which shattered on the floor. I'm sorry, I'm so clumsy, she muttered as she bent down to pick up the pieces. That's okay, Elizabeth replied calmly. We all make mistakes sometimes. That evening, alone in her bedroom, Elizabeth took out her diary. On a blank page, she began to write a plan. Check all bank statements for the last 5 years. Find and analyze all unusual expenses. Reconnect with old friends. They may know something. Hire a private detective. Start transferring money to a separate account little by little. Gather all the necessary documents. Find a good lawyer. They think I don't notice anything, she wrote at the bottom of the page. But 40 years of marriage have taught me one thing, to watch and wait for the right moment. Elizabeth closed the diary and hid it in a secret drawer of her dressing table. There was a long way to go, but she knew that the truth always comes to the surface. The only question was who would control the process. The following week, Elizabeth took action. The first step was to meet with Patricia Wilson, a longtime friend and wife of Henry's former business partner. Oh my God, Elizabeth! Patricia hugged her in a cozy downtown cafe. We haven't seen each other in, how long? 5 years? Ever since our husbands fought over that project, Elizabeth reminded her, watching her friend's reaction carefully. Patricia tensed. Yes, that terrible incident. Robert still can't talk about it calmly. You know, I never really understood what really happened, Elizabeth began cautiously. Henry said it was a simple misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? Patricia laughed bitterly. Your husband almost bankrupted us. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. No, go on. Elizabeth stepped forward. I want to know the truth. Henry was running money through shell companies. Patricia lowered her voice. Robert accidentally found the documents and tried to talk to him, and then he suddenly found himself in the lurch. He barely escaped prison. Elizabeth felt herself getting cold inside. A shell company? But why? Oh dear, Patricia sighed. You really don't know? He's been leading a double life for years. These companies are a way to hide expenses from you. Tell me everything, Elizabeth asked, pulling out her notebook. Over the next hour, she learned more than she had in the last 20 years. Stories of secret accounts, hidden assets, fraudulent documents, and about women. Many different women. Do you remember Martha Collins? Patricia asked. She worked for you as a housekeeper about 10 years ago. Such a sweet girl, Elizabeth nodded. She went to look after her sick mother, I think. Sick mother? Patricia shook her head. Henry bought her a house in Florida, but when she began to demand more, he quickly got rid of her. Elizabeth wrote down every word. Names, dates, amounts. The picture became clearer and clearer. Why didn't you tell me earlier? She finally asked. We all tried. Hinted, Patricia sighed. But you didn't want to see. And then Henry made sure we stopped talking. After the meeting, Elizabeth went to the office of the private detective Patricia had recommended. Mrs. Montgomery, Michael Burns shook her hand. What can I do for you? I need all the information about my husband's financial transactions for the last 10 years, she said, placing an envelope on the table. And all the women who have worked in our house. This could be dangerous, the detective warned. People like your husband are usually good at covering their tracks, but not good enough. Elizabeth took a folder out of her bag. Here are copies of some documents I found. This could be a start. Michael looked through the papers and his eyebrows went up. Impressive. You've already done some serious work. 40 years of marriage teaches you to be careful, Elizabeth replied dryly. How much time do you need? A week for the initial investigation. But there is something else. He hesitated. Are you sure you want to know everything? Some things might be unpleasant. Elizabeth looked him straight in the eye. Mr. Burns, I have lived 40 years of lies. Believe me, the truth cannot be worse. On her way home, she spotted Margaret's car in front of the house. It was only 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The housewife usually left later. Henry was waiting for her in the living room. Where have you been, dear? I was worried. I met with Patricia Wilson, Elizabeth replied, watching his reaction. Henry froze. Patricia? Why, for old time's sake, she shrugged. By the way, she told me an interesting story about that project you did together. Don't believe a word she says, he interrupted abruptly. She and her husband are just jealous of our success. Elizabeth slowly climbed the stairs to her bedroom. The mirror reflected a confident woman, not the naive girl she had been 40 years ago. Now she knew that information was her most powerful weapon, and she had just begun to collect her arsenal. A week passed. Elizabeth was sitting in Michael Burns' office, looking through a thick folder of documents. This is even more than I expected, she said, flipping through the pages. Your husband has been careless, the detective replied. Especially lately. Take a look at these transactions. Elizabeth studied the bank statements. Tens of thousands of dollars were transferred to different accounts every month. Blue Lake Investments, she read. What's that? A shell company, Michael explained. It's registered in the Cayman Islands. Significant sums of money pass through it, and it's all withdrawn in cash from time to time, Elizabeth said. Interesting. At that moment, her phone rang. Henry's. Yes, dear? She answered calmly. Where are you? Margaret said you left in the morning. At the bank, taking care of some business, she lied easily. You know how much I'm into finance now. A pause on the other end. Honey, I think you're getting too involved in all this, he said finally. Maybe you should leave it to me. Oh, no, dear, she replied sweetly. I'm enjoying it so much. By the way, I've signed up for a financial management course. Another pause, a longer one. Okay, he finally said. See you tonight. Elizabeth hung up the phone and went back to her paperwork. He's nervous, Michael said. That's good. Tell me about his partners, she asked. The main one is Richard Turner. The detective took out a new folder. They're working on several large projects together, but there is one interesting detail. It turned out that Richard also had accounts in the same offshore zone, and he regularly transferred money to the same accounts as Henry. They have each other's backs, Elizabeth nodded. What if one of them, say, receives an anonymous letter about the other's machinations? Michael raised an eyebrow. That's risky. They might unite against a common threat, or they might start to suspect each other. Elizabeth smiled. Especially if the letter contains some private details. She took an envelope from her bag. Send this to Richard's home address, so that his wife can intercept it. Returning home, Elizabeth found Margaret cleaning Henry's office. Oh, Mrs. Montgomery, the housewife shuddered. I was just... Go on, Elizabeth nodded. By the way, I've noticed that you've been staying up late lately. A lot of work, Margaret muttered. Of course, Elizabeth agreed. Perhaps we should give you a raise. Let's say 50%? Margaret froze. What? You work so hard, Elizabeth came closer. And I'm sure you keep many secrets of our family. I don't understand. Oh, I think you understand perfectly, Elizabeth said gently. And I appreciate your loyalty. The only question is to whom you are more loyal. Henry came home late that night, obviously worried. Has something happened? Elizabeth asked innocently. Richard received some strange letter, he replied, pouring himself a whiskey. His wife has made a scandal of it. Oh, how unpleasant, she sympathized. But you and he are all right, aren't you? Henry looked at her suspiciously. Of course. Why do you ask? It's just that you've been working together for so many years. She shrugged. It would be a shame if something spoiled your friendship. Later, lying in bed, Elizabeth heard Henry talking to someone for a long time on the phone in his office. His voice was tense, and he repeatedly said, "That's impossible," and "I have to check everything." The next morning, he announced that he was going on a business trip. "For how long?" she asked. "For a few days," he answered, avoiding her gaze. "Important negotiations. With Richard?" she asked innocently. He looked at her sharply, but said nothing. When the door closed behind Henry, Elizabeth pulled out her phone. "Mr. Burns?" "He's gone. You can start the second stage." And then she called Margaret. "Sit down, please. We need to have a serious talk about your future in this house." "I don't understand what you mean." Margaret nervously crumpled the edge of her apron as she sat in front of Elizabeth in the living room. "You understand perfectly well." Elizabeth opened her laptop. "Let's see. 3 loans from different banks, late payments, collection agencies. It's hard to support a sick mother on a housewife's salary, isn't it?" Margaret turned pale. "How are you?" "I've made a lot of new friends." Elizabeth smiled. "I'm surprised that such large debts didn't prevent you from buying a new car. And that pretty Cartier bracelet. It was a gift from Henry, I know," Elizabeth interrupted. "But did you know that such gifts can be considered income? And unpaid taxes are a serious offense." Fear appeared in Margaret's eyes. "What do you want?" "Cooperation," Elizabeth answered simply. "I need information. All the information about my husband's business. And believe me, I have more to offer than jewelry. But Mr. Montgomery is too busy saving his business right now." Elizabeth opened another file. "Do you know what this is? A list of all the women who worked in this house before you. Guess where they are now?" Margaret remained silent. "Most of them were left with nothing," Elizabeth continued. "Some received small gifts, but then disappeared. Henry is very good at getting rid of people when they become inconvenient." "He told me he loved me," Margaret whispered. "He told everyone." Elizabeth pulled out a pile of papers. "Here, letters from previous employees. Very similar promises, very similar gifts. Even the words are the same." Margaret grabbed the letters with trembling hands. This is impossible." "Unfortunately, it is very possible," Elizabeth said gently. "But you have a chance to get out of this situation to your advantage. What do you suggest?" "First, I can help with your debts." Elizabeth opened another document. "Here is a restructuring plan. Second, I guarantee you recommendations for work in any city you choose. And thirdly—" At that moment, Margaret's phone rang. Henry's name appeared on the screen. "Don't answer it," Elizabeth said. "He just wants to know if everything is quiet at home." Margaret stared at the phone as it continued to ring. "What if you answer, I'll send the documents about your unpaid taxes to the relevant authorities," Elizabeth said calmly. "The choice is yours." The phone kept ringing until it went silent. A minute later, I received a message. "He says he's worried," Margaret whispered. "Of course he is." Elizabeth nodded. "But not for you. He's worried about himself. He's afraid you might say something." "What kind of things?" "Oh, a lot of things." Elizabeth opened a new folder on her laptop. "Like the meetings he held here when I wasn't home, about the documents you helped him hide, the money that went through shell companies." Margaret shuddered. "I know a lot more than you think," Elizabeth replied. "The question is, are you willing to help me fill in the blanks?" "And then what?" Margaret asked after a long pause. "Then you leave this town with a clean credit history and enough money in your account to start a new life." Elizabeth handed her a folder. "Here's my plan. Think about it until tomorrow." After Margaret left, Elizabeth dialed the detective's number. She bit. Make sure she doesn't leave town. And check all her contacts with Henry. In the evening, she received a message from her husband. "How are things at home? Margaret is not answering the phone." Elizabeth looked at the screen for a long time before answering. "Everything is fine, dear. Margaret is a little sick, so I let her go home. Don't worry, I'll take care of everything." She then opened the bedroom safe and took out a folder of documents she had found in Henry's office. It was time to make some calls to his business partners. The next few days turned into a sophisticated game of cat and mouse. Elizabeth methodically gathered information, while Henry tried to control the situation from afar. "Mrs. Montgomery," Margaret appeared in the morning with red eyes from insomnia. I agree." Elizabeth put down the newspaper. "Sit down. Tell me everything from the beginning. It started almost immediately after I came to work." Margaret spoke quietly. "At first, there were just compliments, then gifts. And then he asked you to help with the paperwork," Elizabeth finished. Margaret nodded. "He said it was just business, that everyone does it." Over the next hour, Margaret talked about secret meetings, hidden documents, and conversations with partners. Elizabeth wrote everything down, sometimes clarifying details. "And now the most important thing," she finally said. "Where does he keep the original documents?" "In the safe behind the painting in the study," Margaret answered. "But there's a complicated code." Elizabeth smiled. "Our anniversary. He always uses the same passwords." Later that day, the phone rang. "Honey," Henry's voice sounded tense. "How are you?" "I'm fine, darling. When are you coming back?" Tomorrow. We have had some difficulties with our partners." "Oh?" Elizabeth tried to sound surprised. "Is it serious?" No, just a misunderstanding," he said. "Listen, have you noticed anything strange lately? Strange letters? Calls?" "Everything's quiet," she answered. "Although, Richard Turner called yesterday. He seemed very worried. A pause on the other end of the line. What did he want?" "I don't know, I didn't pick up. Why?" "Nothing," he answered quickly. "If he calls again, don't answer. He's been a little off lately." After the conversation, Elizabeth dialed the detective's number. "He's coming back tomorrow. Is everything ready?" "Yes," Michael answered. "The documents have been sent to all the partners. They've already started asking questions." "Great." Elizabeth looked at her watch. Time for the final preparations. She walked over to the safe in her office, opened it easily, and began to sort through the papers. She already had copies of the most important documents, but now she arranged them in a special order so that Henry would immediately notice that someone had looked at them. Margaret watched her from the doorway. "Are you sure this will work?" "Oh yes." Elizabeth closed the safe. "Henry is very predictable. When he notices that the documents have been reviewed, he will first suspect you. Then he'll realize you're working for me. And then what? Then he'll do what he always does. He'll try to settle things with money." Elizabeth took an envelope out of her bag. "Here, this is your ticket to California and money for the first time. You'll be leaving tomorrow morning. But what about—" "Believe me, it's better you don't be here when the real storm hits." Elizabeth woke up early the next morning. Margaret had already left, quietly, without saying goodbye. On the kitchen table was an envelope with all the copies of documents she had collected for Henry over the years. At 10 in the morning, a taxi pulled up. Henry was back. He looked tired and worried. "Where's Margaret?" he asked, looking around. "Oh, she took a vacation," Elizabeth replied calmly. "A family emergency." Henry froze. "What circumstances?" "I don't know the details." Elizabeth shrugged. "By the way, the bank called while you were gone. Something about checking transactions." He turned to her abruptly. "What exactly did they say?" "I told them you'd contact them yourself." She looked him straight in the eye. "It's your business, isn't it?" Henry rushed into the office. A minute later, he heard a muffled scream as he noticed that the safe was being opened. Elizabeth calmly poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down in her chair. Now all that remained was to wait. Elizabeth was sitting in an elegant restaurant across from Victoria Stanford, the city's leading divorce lawyer. In her 40 years of practicing law, Victoria had seen many difficult cases, but Elizabeth's story clearly piqued her interest. "So you have evidence of financial fraud," Victoria looked through the file. "And evidence of adultery, and witnesses," Elizabeth added, "including former employees." "Impressive." The lawyer looked up. "Usually clients come to me with suspicions. You brought me a ready-made case. I've had a lot of time to prepare," Elizabeth replied. 40 years to be exact. At that moment, her phone vibrated. A message from Patricia. Richard Turner just filed a lawsuit against Henry. Allegations of fraud. It seems things are moving faster than we planned. Elizabeth showed the message to her lawyer. That's even better. Victoria nodded. The criminal investigation will significantly weaken his position in the divorce. Suddenly, Helen Turner, Richard's wife, entered the restaurant. Noticing Elizabeth, she strode decisively toward their table. You, she pointed her finger at Elizabeth. Did you send that anonymous letter? Helen, please sit down, Elizabeth replied calmly. We have something to talk about. About what? About how our husbands have been cheating on us for years? That's exactly what we need to talk about. Elizabeth pulled back her chair. And what we can do about it. Over the next hour, the three women discussed strategy. It turned out that Helen had also been collecting information about her husband's machinations. They thought we were just stupid trophy wives. Helen smiled bitterly. That we didn't notice anything. Men often underestimate their wives, said Victoria. This is their biggest mistake. At that moment, Elizabeth's phone rang again. Henry. Yes, dear? Where are you? His voice sounded tense. We need to talk. I'm at a meeting with friends, she replied calmly. Is it urgent? Urgent? He almost shouted. Do you know what's going on? Richard is suing me, and all the documents are gone from the safe. Really? How unpleasant. Elizabeth made a sign to Victoria, who was already recording the conversation. And what are these documents? Don't pretend. He lowered his voice. It's you, isn't it? You and this... Margaret? Darling, you're scaring me. Her voice trembled just enough to sound convincing. Maybe you should calm down and explain everything. I will explain, he said. When you come home. Oh, I'm afraid I'll be back late tonight, Elizabeth replied. I have an appointment with the banker. Something about our joint accounts. Silence on the other end of the line. What are you up to? He finally asked. IA? Nothing, dear. I'm just finally taking an interest in our finances. Just like you wanted all these years. After the conversation ended, Helen looked at Elizabeth with respect. That was impressive. Years of practice, she replied. By the way, how is your husband? He's hysterical. Helen showed the message on her phone. He's demanding explanations, threatening to divorce. Great, Victoria nodded. Let him file for divorce first. It will play into our hands. And now the most interesting thing. Elizabeth took another folder out of her bag. Do you know who called me yesterday? Paul Weston's wife, the main investor? Helen stepped forward. That's right. And it turns out she also has something to tell us about our husband's financial schemes. Victoria quickly took notes. This is going beyond a simple divorce. There could be a serious investigation here. And that's fine, Elizabeth replied calmly. Let everyone know the truth. As they were leaving the restaurant, Elizabeth received another message from a detective. Henry just made a large cash withdrawal. It looks like he's going to run away. Everything is going according to plan, she whispered as she got into a taxi. According to my plan. The evening at the Green Valley Country Club promised to be special. The annual charity ball brought together the city's elite businessmen, politicians, and their wives. Elizabeth had chosen this moment for a reason. Are you sure? Victoria asked, adjusting her evening dress. We can do this more, privately. Oh no, Elizabeth smiled. Henry loves publicity. Let him have it in full. She entered the room arm in arm with Michael Burns, who was playing the role of her companion today. Henry, who was talking to a group of businessmen, was visibly tense. Darling, he hurried to her. I didn't know you were coming. Really? Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. I received a personal invitation from the board of directors. Fear flashed in his eyes. We need to talk. In private. Oh, I think we have a lot to say to each other in public. She raised her voice enough to attract the attention of those around her. For example, about Blue Lake Investments. Henry paled. Elizabeth, not here. Why not? She looked around the room. Look, all your partners are here. Richard, Paul. Oh, and their wives too. People began to approach them, sensing that a scandal was brewing. You know, Elizabeth turned to the audience. My husband always said that I didn't understand anything about business. Maybe that's why he thought I wouldn't notice his fraudulent offshore accounts? Shut up, Henry hissed. Or his affairs with housewives? She continued. By the way, Margaret says hello. She's somewhere in California, enjoying life with the money you tried to hide from me. The room fell silent. Henry looked around and everyone was looking at him. This is slander, he shouted. She's gone mad, really? Elizabeth took a folder out of her purse. Then perhaps you could explain these documents? Account statements, copies of contracts. Oh, and of course, the photographs of your meetings with Margaret. Richard Turner stepped forward. Henry, is it true? You used our joint projects to launder money? Richard, not now. Henry tried to pull his friend aside. Why not now? Helen Turner interjected. It's time to talk about all your dirty deeds. The guests began to whisper. Elizabeth saw some of them pulling out their phones and filming everything. And you know what's the funniest thing? She continued. He thought I was a naive housewife who didn't notice anything. For 40 years, I endured his cheating, his lies, and all the while I was collecting evidence. What evidence? Henry's voice trembled. Oh, there is enough, Victoria replied, stepping forward. And not just for a divorce. The prosecutor's office will be very interested in some details. Henry took a step toward the exit, but Michael Burns blocked his path. Where are you going, Mr. Montgomery? The evening is just beginning. Who are you? Henry wheezed. A private detective, Michael smiled. Your wife has made great preparations. The guests began to leave, giving Henry disdainful glances. His business partners turned away, and the wives of his former friends looked at him with open hostility. You've ruined everything, he whispered to Elizabeth. No, dear. She looked him straight in the eye. It was you who ruined everything. I just opened people's eyes to the truth. 2 men in suits appeared at the door. Mr. Montgomery, we're from the financial police. We need to talk to you. Elizabeth watched as her husband was led out of the room. 40 years of humiliation and lies ended in one evening. You did well, Victoria said as she approached her. Are you ready for the next step? Oh, yes, Elizabeth nodded. Now the fun begins. A month passed. Elizabeth was sitting on the terrace of her new house on the coast, the one she was planning to give Henry for their anniversary. The sea was making noise below, and the evening sun was painting the sky in warm colors. Here's your coffee, Mrs. Montgomery. Anna, the new housekeeper, put the cup on the table. This time, Elizabeth was more careful in choosing her staff. She checked all the references and hired through an agency. Thank you, Anna. You can be free for today. Opening the morning newspaper, Elizabeth saw a familiar photo of Henry being led out of the courthouse. Famous businessman convicted of financial fraud, the headline screamed. Her phone rang. Victoria. Congratulations, the lawyer said. The divorce is officially finalized. All assets have been divided according to our requirements. How much did he get? Elizabeth asked calmly. 10%, as we planned. Given the criminal case, he didn't even try to argue. Elizabeth took a sip of her coffee. What about the company? The board of directors has appointed a new CEO. By the way, it's Helen Turner. It turned out she has a great business education. Who would have thought? Elizabeth smiled. A lot has changed since the scandal. The wives of influential businessmen suddenly discovered their talents, some in managing companies, some in charity, some in art. What about Margaret? She asked. She opened a small cafe in San Diego. It looks like she's finally found her calling. Elizabeth walked to the edge of the terrace. A private beach stretched below, now all hers. As was the house in the city, as was most of the company's shares, as was everything else Henry had tried to hide from her for years. The doorbell rang and Patricia came in. Have you seen the papers? She asked, hugging her friend. Yes, Elizabeth nodded. It seems that our husbands finally got what they deserved. Richard, too. Can you believe he tried to run away to Mexico? Patricia laughed. But Helen had already frozen all the accounts. They sat on the terrace, watching the sunset. You know, Patricia said after a pause, I always thought you were the weakest of us. So, correct, so patient. Patience is not always a sign of weakness, Elizabeth replied. Sometimes it is the strongest weapon. She took an envelope out of her bag. By the way, I'm starting a fund to support women who have suffered from domestic violence and financial manipulation. Would you like to be a member of the board? Patricia looked over the documents. You're using Henry's money to help other women? Patricia, it's only fair, isn't it? Elizabeth smiled. Let his years of deception benefit someone. In the evening, alone, Elizabeth stood in front of her bedroom mirror for a long time. The same room, the same mirror, where she had prepared for her anniversary celebration a month ago. But the woman in the reflection was different, stronger, more confident, free. Her diary was on the dressing table. She opened a new page and wrote, For 40 years I lived someone else's life, playing the role of an ideal wife. Now my real story begins, and this time I will be the main character, not an extra in someone else's play. Elizabeth closed her diary and went to the window. The sea below was making noise, bringing coolness. A new life was ahead of her own life, and she knew for sure, the best revenge is not just a victory, but the ability to make this victory the beginning of something greater.